Good afternoon, Professor Pegram. Thank you for participating in this mock session of the Jean Monnet Network on EU-China relations, and specifically about your work on understanding the role of global governance. For instance, we would like to ask you about how international organizations contribute to global governance.
International organizations are really the backbone of global governance, but it is important to note that they're not synonymous with global governance. International organizations can be defined as entities established by formal political agreements among member states that have permanent structures, permanent secretariats. The question of what they actually do, it really depends upon who you ask, but common functions include facilitating cooperation among member states, but also between governments and non-state actors. In institutional language, we might talk about focal points for coordination of policies among nations. They also provide a platform for dialogue, for negotiation, and importantly, they're very involved in the domain of peacekeeping and conflict resolution. Perhaps more controversially, international organizations also play a part in creating and enforcing international law and norms, although they have a mixed record in this regard. Interesting case studies to look at that would be, for example, the United Nations Security Council or the World Trade Organization Investor-State Dispute Settlement Mechanism. I think historically international organizations have played a big part also in the economic domain in terms of economic stability, economic development, providing financial aid and development projects in the global south. And of course also serving as the forum for global trade negotiations. The last thing I'd just mention is I think international organizations play an important role in amplifying and addressing transboundary global issues such as human rights, such as, of course, pandemics and climate change.
Thanks for your answer. And considering all that, what are the main obstacles to effective global governance today?
Well, where to start? Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, recently spoke of the danger of a great fracture in multilateral systems. And he pointed to a number of different obstacles which are really exercising the minds of UN officials and the supporters of global governance. Perhaps most of all, that is a resurgence of nationalism and a resurgence of demands for re-territorialization of national sovereignty. And this takes the form of resistance to global norms within the United Nations different forums, within the General Assembly, and a strong reluctance among member parties, member states, to concede national autonomy in the service of transboundary coordination and cooperation. Underlying that, of course, there are persistent questions as to the extent to which global governance is actually representative. And many rising, emerging markets, rising powers, notably the BRICS, have long voiced concerns around the dominance and influence of some major Western powers within the core structures of global governance. And indeed, we see that playing out in debate and in reform on ensuring equal representation and voice for a wider array of member state parties within different multilateral forums within the security space, as well as perhaps most consequentially as well in the economic space. And I suppose the other issue, which has always been a perennial challenge within climate change and within health, but really across the board, is that many different member states bring many different interests, different capacities, different priorities. And we have ongoing issues around different blocs competing to impose their interests onto the agenda of the United Nations. And coupled with that, we have questions of institutional inefficiencies. The UN is often criticized for its bureaucratic processes, its slow response times in the face of critical emergency issues. Whether or not that's fair is, I think, a moot point and, well, frankly, an empirical question. And I think looking ahead, the big obstacle is just adapting to an increasingly complex global landscape where we have many different issues that interconnect and are interdependent, but we also have many more actors on the stage, such as multinational corporations and, of course, non-governmental organizations.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Finally, do you think that global governance is a key to tackle transnational challenges like climate change?
Well, I think this is the million-dollar question. It's a very good question. And frankly, we don't really know. Some scholars argue that we do have good enough global governance in place to tackle those sorts of transboundary, transnational challenges. But others, like Thomas Weiss, are quite clear that they regard that as complacent, that actually the current structures are not adequate to the task. I think certainly there is an impressively sophisticated apparatus above the nation state in the climate change space with significant capacity. And of course, we're talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We're talking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And, we do have some precedent of different instruments which have achieved member state consensus, such as the Kyoto Protocol, such as the Paris Agreement, which have had some impact. And, I think it really depends on your vantage point as to whether that impact is good enough or not. But, when we look at climate change, we clearly need to move the dial and we need to ratchet up ambition. And that's what these sorts of global governance multilateral platforms are seeking to do. They're really seeking to engage all member states in a long-term collaborative process. They're also seeking to mediate among very different national interests, while also taking into account the global needs that such a domain throws up in terms of the collective action problem posed by climate change, where no single country can actually solve the problem. It does require collective action at a global scale. So what we see right now, getting into sort of the more intricate side of the Paris Agreement, are efforts to ensure policies are coherent, that policies are actionable, and in some instances that policies are enforceable, although enforcement is delegated down to the nation state level. Nevertheless, there are some very innovative mechanisms within the Paris Agreement that seek to hold different member states accountable for their commitments under that agreement. And I would also note, perhaps most importantly, the evolution of the climate change UN regime has seen the engagement of many more non-state actors in recent years, including, of course, civil society, but also corporations and indeed indigenous communities. And it's going to be really a collective effort, I would say, if solutions, long-term sustainable solutions, are going to be found to this daunting challenge.
Thank you so much again for your participation on this project, Professor, and we hope to collaborate with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.